In just 47 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved actors went from charming guest to furious adversary, unleashing a verbal assault on Ruth Langsford that left the Loose Women panel in absolute shock. What started as light conversation about his legendary career exploded into a catastrophic meltdown when the host pushed too far, crossed every line, and turned a simple chat into the most explosive television moment of the year. Michael Caine didn't just walk off that stage last night. He stormed off in disgust, leaving Ruth speechless and the studio in complete chaos. Before we dive into this absolute carnage, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the moments that shake the entertainment industry to its core. Hit that subscribe button now, because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Last night's episode of Loose Women was supposed to be a celebration. Michael Caine, the 89-year-old acting icon, had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his incredible 7-decade career in film. The audience was packed with fans eager to hear stories from the man who gave us Alfie, The Italian Job, and countless other classics. The panel seemed thrilled to have him there. Janet Street Porter was grinning from ear to ear. Colleen Nolan looked starstruck. But Ruth Langsford, sitting in the host's chair, had something else planned entirely. The interview began pleasantly enough. Michael walked onto the set to thunderous applause, that signature Cockney charm radiating from him as he settled into the guest chair. He was wearing a smart navy blazer, looking every bit the gentleman everyone knows him to be. Ruth welcomed him with a bright smile, thanking him for taking the time to join them. The first few minutes were filled with easy banter about his latest projects and memories from his early days in the industry. "You've had such an extraordinary career, Michael," Ruth said, leaning forward with what seemed like genuine interest. "Tell us, what's the secret to staying relevant for so many decades?" Michael chuckled, that warm laugh that's comforted audiences for generations. "Well, Ruth, I think it's about loving what you do and never taking yourself too seriously. I've been very fortunate to work with brilliant people and tell stories that matter." The audience clapped appreciatively. Janet jumped in with a question about his favorite co-stars, and Michael launched into a delightful story about working with Sean Connery. Everything felt normal, celebratory even. But then Ruth steered the conversation in a different direction. "Michael, I want to ask you about something you said in an interview a few years back," Ruth began, her tone shifting slightly. "You made some comments about the film industry and how it's changed. Some people found those comments a bit, shall we say, controversial?" Michael's smile faded just a touch. "I'm not sure which interview you're referring to, Ruth. I've given thousands over the years." "You talked about modern filmmaking," Ruth pressed on, ignoring his polite deflection. "About how standards have dropped and how some of today's actors don't have the same work ethic. Do you still stand by that?" The audience went quiet. Colleen shot Ruth a concerned glance. Michael shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. "I think what I was saying," Michael replied carefully, "was that the industry has changed tremendously since I started. That's not necessarily good or bad. It's just different. I have enormous respect for today's performers." Ruth wasn't satisfied with that answer. "But you specifically said that some modern actors are lazy and entitled. Those were your words, weren't they?" "Ruth, I don't think this is quite fair," Janet interjected, sensing the tension building. "Michael came here to talk about his career, not to be interrogated about. I'm just asking him to clarify his position." Ruth cut her off sharply, her eyes fixed on Michael. "I think our viewers deserve to know if he really believes the younger generation of actors are inferior to his." Michael's jaw tightened. The legendary composure he's known for was starting to crack. "I never said anyone was inferior, Ruth. I was making an observation about how the business has changed. The studio system I came up in no longer exists. That's a fact, not an insult." "So you do think things were better in your day?" Ruth pushed, a hint of something cold creeping into her voice. "In some ways, yes," Michael admitted. "We had to work incredibly hard to even get noticed. There was no social media, no instant fame. You earned your place through years of training and rejection." Ruth pounced. "That sounds rather dismissive of how hard young actors work today, doesn't it? My own son is trying to break into acting, and I can tell you he works incredibly hard." "Are you saying he's not working as hard as you did?" The other panelists looked mortified. This had stopped being an interview and turned into something else entirely. Michael's face flushed slightly. I don't know your son, Ruth, so I couldn't possibly comment on his work ethic, Michael said, his voice measured but with an edge now. But I do know that when I was starting out, we didn't have the opportunities for exposure that exist today. That's not a criticism, it's an observation. It sounds like criticism to me, Ruth shot back. It sounds like you think you're better than today's generation of performers. That is absolutely not what I'm saying, Michael replied, his voice rising slightly. Ruth, I'm not sure why you're trying to twist my words here. I'm not twisting anything, Ruth insisted, her tone becoming more aggressive. I'm simply trying to get you to admit what you really think. You believe you're part of some golden era of cinema, and everyone who came after is somehow lesser. Janet tried again to intervene. Ruth, come on. This isn't. Stay out of this, Janet. Ruth snapped without looking at her colleague. Michael, answer the question. Michael stared at her for a long moment, and you could see decades of professionalism warring with genuine anger in his eyes. There is no question to answer, Ruth. You're creating an argument where none exists. I came here in good faith to have a pleasant conversation, not to be ambushed. Ambushed? Ruth let out a harsh laugh. Oh, so now you're the victim? You can dish it out, but you can't take it when someone challenges you? The audience was dead silent now, the discomfort in the studio palpable. Colleen had her hand over her mouth. Even the crew members looked shocked at how nasty this had become. I beg your pardon? Michael said slowly, his famous composure completely shattered now. You heard me, Ruth continued, leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed. You've spent years making snide comments about modern film, about streaming services, about young actors, but the moment someone pushes back, you act like you're being attacked. That's pretty rich, Michael. Snide comments? Michael's voice was louder now, and you could hear the anger breaking through. I have never been snide about anyone in this industry. I've expressed opinions about how things have changed, which is my right after working in this business for 70 bloody years. Language, Michael, Ruth said with a smug smile that made everything so much worse. That smile was the match that lit the fuse. Don't you dare patronize me, Michael fired back, his finger pointing at her. Who the hell do you think you are? I agreed to come on this program as a courtesy, and you're sitting there trying to paint me as some bitter old man who resents young people. That is categorically untrue, and you know it. I'm just going by your own words, Ruth replied coolly, still wearing that infuriating smile. If you don't like how they sound when repeated back to you, perhaps you shouldn't have said them. This is unbelievable, Michael said, shaking his head. You've taken things out of context, twisted them to mean something they don't, and now you're sitting there acting like you've caught me in some lie. This isn't journalism, Ruth. This is a bloody ambush. There's that word again, Ruth said. Ambush. As if asking you to stand by your own statements is some kind of attack. You know what I think, Michael? I think you're not used to being challenged. You've been praised and celebrated for so long that you can't handle it when someone doesn't treat you like royalty. The other panelists were trying to make themselves invisible at this point. The camera operators didn't know where to point their lenses. This had gone so far beyond uncomfortable that it had entered a completely different realm. Praised and celebrated? Michael's laugh was bitter now. Do you have any idea what I've been through in this industry? The rejection, the criticism, the years of struggling before I ever got a decent role? I worked in a factory, Ruth. I served in the military. I came from nothing and earned every single thing I have through sheer determination and hard work. Don't you dare lecture me about being challenged. Oh, here we go, Ruth said, rolling her eyes dramatically. The working class hero speech. Yes, Michael, we all know you're from Elephant and Castle. You've only mentioned it in every interview you've ever given. We get it. You had it tough. That doesn't give you the right to look down on people who came after you. I don't look down on anyone, Michael practically shouted now, his face red. But I do have the right to observe that the industry has changed, and not all of those changes have been for the better. That's not controversial. That's common sense. What's changed is that people like you don't get to control the narrative anymore. Ruth shot back, her voice dripping with contempt now. The old guard is dying out, and you can't stand it. You can't stand that young actors today have different paths to success. You can't stand that they use social media and streaming platforms. You think everything should still be the way it was in your heyday. But newsflash, Michael, your heyday is over. The audience gasped audibly. Janet and Colleen looked absolutely horrified. Ruth had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Michael went very still. His face transformed from angry to something else entirely. Something cold and disappointed. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but cut through the studio like a knife. I have been in this business since before you were born, Ruth. I have worked with the greatest directors, actors, and writers who ever lived. I have won Academy Awards. I have been knighted by the Queen. But none of that matters right now, because what you just said reveals everything about who you are as a person. Oh, please, Ruth scoffed. But there was something uncertain in her eyes now. No, you're going to listen to me, Michael continued, his voice steady and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting. You invited me here under false pretenses. You pretended this would be a friendly conversation about my career. But what you really wanted was to tear me down on national television. Why? To make yourself look tough? To prove something to your viewers? Whatever your reasons. It's pathetic. How dare you call me pathetic? Ruth hissed. I'll call you whatever I like at this point because you've earned it, Michael replied. You are a bully, Ruth. You ambushed a guest, twisted their words, insulted them repeatedly, and now you're acting indignant because they finally pushed back. That's the definition of a bully. Get off your high horse, Ruth snapped. You think because you're Michael Caine you can just insult me on my own show? Your show? Michael let out a harsh laugh. This isn't your show, Ruth. This is Loose Women. You're just one of the hosts, and from what I'm seeing today, you're not even a particularly good one. A good host makes their guests feel welcome. A good host asks thoughtful questions and listens to the answers. A good host doesn't ambush an 89-year-old man who came here as a favor. A favor? Ruth's voice went up an octave. Oh, we're so blessed that Michael Caine graced us with his presence. Should we all bow down? You're being ridiculous now, Michael said, standing up from his chair. I'm not going to sit here and be insulted any longer. This has been one of the most unprofessional experiences of my entire career, and that's saying something. Sit down, Michael, Ruth commanded. We're not finished. Oh, yes we are, Michael replied firmly. I'm done with this farce. And I'm done with you. You can't just walk off, Ruth said, a note of panic entering her voice for the first time as she realized the interview was completely falling apart on live television. Watch me, Michael said simply. Ruth's face twisted with anger and humiliation. She had lost control of the situation entirely, and everyone watching knew it. In a last desperate attempt to regain some authority, she said the words that would define this disaster. Fine then, leave. Nobody wants you here anyway. Michael stopped and turned back to face her, his expression one of complete disgust. You know what, Ruth? I actually feel sorry for you. You've got a good job, a platform to reach millions of people, and this is what you choose to do with it. You choose to be cruel and vindictive. You choose to ambush guests and twist their words. You choose to be a bully. That's incredibly sad. Don't you dare pity me, Ruth spat. I don't need anything from you, especially not your sympathy. Clearly you need something, Michael replied, because happy, fulfilled people don't behave the way you just did. I hope you figure out whatever's eating at you, Ruth. I really do. But I won't be part of this circus any longer. Then go, Ruth shouted, standing up now too. Get out, you're kicked off this show. I was already leaving, Michael said calmly. But thank you for making it official. Really shows your class. He started walking toward the exit, his dignity somehow intact despite the chaos. The audience didn't know whether to clap or sit in silence. Most chose silence, too stunned by what they'd just witnessed. But Ruth wasn't finished. In what would become the defining moment of this catastrophe, she called after him one more time. That's right, run away, just like your generation always does when challenged. Michael stopped at the edge of the stage. For a moment it looked like he might turn around, might come back and say something else, but instead, he just shook his head slowly and continued walking. The disappointment in that gesture spoke volumes more than any words could have. Janet immediately stood up, clearly trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Michael, please don't, let him go, Ruth interrupted sharply. If he can't handle a simple conversation, then we're better off without him. A simple conversation? Caine finally spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. Ruth, that was not a simple conversation. That was an attack. Oh, not you too, Ruth groaned. I was just asking him tough questions. That's what journalists do. We're not journalists, Janet said quietly but firmly. We're talk show hosts. And what you just did was completely out of line. I don't need a lecture from you, Janet, Ruth snapped. Well, you're getting one anyway, Janet fired back, the frustration evident in her voice. You humiliated that man for no reason. You twisted his words, you insulted him, and you tried to make him look like some kind of villain when all he did was share his perspective on his own industry. That was disgraceful, Ruth. The audience started applauding Janet's words, which only made Ruth angrier. Fine, everyone gang up on me, Ruth said bitterly. I'm the bad guy for doing my job. That wasn't your job, Caine added, her voice still shaking. Your job is to make guests feel comfortable and have interesting conversations, not to ambush them and drive them off the show. He walked off on his own, Ruth protested weakly. Because you kicked him off, Janet exclaimed. Your last words to him were literally, get out, and you're kicked off this show. How can you possibly deny that? Ruth's face was flushed now, a mixture of anger and embarrassment as she realized the entire panel had turned against her. The producers were frantically signaling from off-camera, trying to figure out how to salvage the remaining airtime. You know what? Ruth said, her voice tight. Perhaps we should take a break. Perhaps we should, Janet agreed coldly. As they cut to commercial, the damage was done. Caine had left the building, his first and likely last appearance on Loose Women ending in spectacular disaster. The man who had charmed audiences for 70 years, who had worked with everyone from Laurence Olivier to Christopher Nolan, had been driven off a daytime talk show by a host who seemed determined to humiliate him. The audience sat in stunned silence as the crew scrambled to figure out what to do next. Some viewers in the studio had their phones out, already posting about what they'd just witnessed. Within minutes, social media would explode with outrage over Ruth's treatment of the beloved actor. Ruth stood at her hosting podium, arms crossed, trying to maintain some dignity, but failing miserably. The look on her face said she knew she'd made a massive mistake, but was too proud or stubborn to admit it. Janet and Caine had moved to the other side of the stage, putting physical distance between themselves and their co-host. The producers eventually decided to end the show early, realizing there was no way to continue after such a spectacular implosion. As the cameras finally shut off, Ruth stormed off the set without a word to anyone. The other panelists immediately huddled together, clearly discussing what had just happened. Caine, meanwhile, was already in his car heading home, his publicist frantically fielding calls from news outlets wanting statements about the confrontation. The actor who had survived 7 decades in Hollywood, who had weathered countless challenges and changes in the industry, had just been subjected to one of the most disrespectful interviews of his career. All because a host decided that making herself look tough was more important than treating a legendary guest with basic human decency. The fallout from this disaster would dominate headlines, but in that moment, as Michael's car pulled away from the studio, one thing was crystal clear. Ruth Langsford had just made one of the biggest mistakes of her television career, and there would be no coming back from it. The legendary actor was gone, his reputation intact despite the ambush, while the host who tried to take him down had only succeeded in exposing her own cruelty and pettiness to millions of viewers. It was a masterclass in how not to conduct an interview, and how treating guests with contempt will always backfire spectacularly. Caine had entered that studio as a beloved icon and left as an even bigger legend, standing up to a bully who thought she could tear him down. Ruth Langsford had entered as a respected host and left as the villain of one of the most shocking talk show disasters in British television history.